Okay. Let me just sort out the notes. Okay. All right. I'll have the chat box open for everybody, so that way I can like respond immediately. Okay. If the panel is ready, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. So as a proud American, I think it's my duty to withdraw from this quarterfinal motion. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, like I'm not going to try and teach Cambridge a specific lesson on equity today. We're going to be talking about the Global Solidarity Fund, and specifically, I think maybe just a brief point of characterization that we need to do before we get into this is I think that there needs to be some acceptance today of that the current methods of structural adjustment and neoliberal policies that have largely been pushed through ideas like the World Bank and even like the Asian Banking and Infrastructure Investment Bank that has largely been modeled after a lot of these current like older institutions in the West has largely failed. And there's been a couple of big impacts that are going to come out of this, but I think specifically like I want to give you an idea of what this is. And specifically it's this idea that the developing nations are coming into their own with the realization that it is not okay to allow larger Western countries to take advantage of them. And then what this then puts the impetus on is the developed nations to understand how to deal with this rising antagonism, to deal with this tainting of image that has occurred over the last few decades and figure this out. We'll take OO right off the bat.
So what kind of decision-making factors are there when you decide who to give aid to? Like, what are your metrics? What's this panel going to do?
Yeah, so I think it's going to be like fairly similar to a lot of like what is tried to do in the sense that like you direct aid. So on the crisis thing, obviously, if there's like a natural disaster or a famine or something like that, you try to direct monetary specific aid or use that monetary aid in a leveraged way. And then on the other hand, like in terms of global investment. So I think this is where the panel of experts are going to come in. We agree it's not going to be like perfectly like there's going to be no outside interest or anything like that, but largely like you try to figure out where the quote unquote best bang for your buck is, where like specific infrastructure investment is needed to be taken like to be put in by an outside authority for like reasons within a nation state that they don't have the existing capital or whatever that. Okay, on to my first point, and the rest of this will be like completely fleshed out in my constructive. So first of all, if the existing things don't work, a history of failure. So I think the structural adjustment program and why neoliberal policies have failed, even when motives are pure, are very telling, right? We think neoliberal policies in which international trade was open and there's a privatization of economy and mass government layoffs and the forced compete of these countries in the international market resulted in a couple massive impacts. The first being that there's a massive shock from this original forcing, i.e. in the past, a lot of these institutions that still exist have forced these countries under mostly like more soft power, but very much the existence of like the ability to push into these markets without the real like full consent of these countries. What it also resulted in was a more unstable economy because the tying of the internal economy within these developing nations to the world markets and the forced compete of these economies of scale in other nations, i.e. there's a driving of wages going down because they're now competing on an international market for labor, and there's also unemployment in the private sector because like maybe now a specific market within the country is not like perfectly optimized within this country and can be like out competed on the international scale. Now, if we examine the bad incentive structure of developed nations when they're pushing neoliberal policies, the condition becomes even more bleak. We see that this with Canada and France with Canadian mining operations and French-controlled currency blocks in which they're directly incentivized to push neoliberal policies onto them for their own gain. But we also notice that developed world doesn't actually follow their own policy, i.e. US subsidizes their own agriculture, which is directly against a lot of the IMF and global bank policies that have come out in the past few decades. What are the large impacts of this and how does this relate to today's debate? I think first of all, it's the idea of a tainted image, right? We think developing nations are more increasingly seeing it as an infringement on their own country and their loss of sovereignty, partly because it literally has been in the past, but also because there's a simple weighing that it's not worth the loss of your own internal monetary policy for any potential gains that may or may not come about. We think it's then unlikely to accept support from these existing institutions specifically because they have failed, i.e. they have failed in the past. Now developing developing nations, while we'll take them at their very best that they have perfect policies now, are more unlikely to then take these policies at good face value, implement them, or even go to them as the first actor of choice. What then happens is that they flee to different actors who come with their own strings attached. Africa was very disadvantaged by structural adjustment, which I mentioned earlier, and now is very much willing to go to China despite high costs with their BRI program. And we think developed countries don't want this for obvious reasons, because these existing institutions like the developing countries still want some contact with them, and they don't want them fleeing directly to it, but it will take CO.
Considering market liberalization and free trade policies, one of the most founding philosophies of economic institutes across the world, why won't experts implement structural adjustment programs?
So we think, yes, if you're operating in 1945, in 1945 post World War II, this is a global idea, but very much now there's not. Like, I think this is one segment of the economy, and this is what has driven those policies in the past. But there has been a large scale shift, especially with the introduction of more globalized markets and different ways of thinking, and specifically the pushback that I'm going to get into my second point. But yeah, so what does the GSF provide as a good alternative? I think that's like functionally what this does is it allows them to maintain a connection with these countries and gives them a stable alternative as opposed to like other more malicious actors when they flee because of a tainted image. Now, onto the direct antagonism and why you're not going to see these things happen. So we think the Doha round negotiations currently within the status quo are a great example of how things are getting locked up. We think that because the World Trade Organization is effectively locked up by China, Brazil, and India because they refuse to submit and bend the knee to these types of policies that we're already talking about, it places an institutional check on new institutions that may come about, such as the GSP. And we think this is important so that way you don't just completely keep rehashing history. We think that developed nations still want to help out for purely reasons that are not like asymmetrically advantaging the developed nations. Tapping into global markets can still be good because you bring in a lot of capital to developing nations, and there's just a general goodwill and responsibility. However, the locking up of current institutions does no good for any actor. And from the point of view of developed nations, you are missing a lot of potential. Ultimately, you want a financial institution that can connect with these things, but is not so overblownly like Western or neoliberal in this path that this will be accepted by these countries, i.e. you build in your own check because the entire point of building up the GSP is so that way it can cause this thing. If the Western countries or any developed nation that donates to it wants to rehash this, we think this is directly against the developed nation's own best interest and will not come about. However, the problem with the existing institutions then is there's all this structural and institutional weight. If anything, we get LSEA's characterization of like this old view of economics within these institutions because that is how they have been doing it for a long time. With the GSP allows us to imagine a better future in which you start from a new building block and a new fundamental idea of world economics.
Thank you very much for that speech. And I'd like to welcome on the floor the leader of UP. You're here.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The fatal flaw that the opening government has made in this debate is assuming that states are altruistic, that states don't have incentives tied to their development aid, and states don't have incentives tied to their support of international structures. International aid has been the founding part of shaping regions and gaining influence in regions. In a world where you take this away from nations, I think the support and buy-in they have for this newly proposed panel of experts significantly decreases. And I think this is incredibly harmful because it leads to end outcomes of very vulnerable developing states falling prey to more predatory versions of loans offered by other malicious actors that are not within the developed circle of nations. So what is opening up support in this debate? I think we support the status quo. So when it comes to giving out loans, developmental aid, and etc., we are happy to defend the Bretton Woods institutions as well as pursue the current policies they are pursuing. I am more than happy to acknowledge with the PM that yes, many of these institutions are quite fucked up and have done some pretty terrible things. But I think if we look on a trend, most of these institutions are on a pathway to reform. This is true for 3 key reasons. Firstly, we've seen an enhancement of the amount of wealth that developing nations have had, thus increasing the amount of funding they have given to these organizations and significantly upgrading the type of influence they have within it. For instance, China at one particular point, while it was the largest economy for a while, the amount of funding they gave once they had an economic boom to like the UN, for instance, allowed for them to access many, many organizations and chairmanships. My point is money talks when it comes to influence in these regions. Many developing nations are getting there. For instance, even like lowly countries like mine, like Malaysia, suddenly are chairing CEDAW. The point is change can happen. The second thing I will say is like most of them also know, and most of the nations and most of these institutions are suffering from a crisis of confidence, whether it's from the economic crash in 2008 or whether it's from the failure to react to Syria, for instance. Many of these institutions know that many members are hanging on by a thread. This means to be able to get buy-in from current member states as well, you must embark on some form of reform. Now, that's why I think the Bretton Woods institution, quite bad, but I think they are getting better. And this is very important for the next response I'm going to give, which is moving into responses to the OG. Their problem is that neoliberalism is a thing. My good friends, who do you think is the panel of experts? They are leftists, is it? Most of them are also going to be neoliberal. The reason for this is because neoliberal values have penetrated every aspect of policy making since the end of World War II, and they have also penetrated every mainstream concession or conception of policy making, even in the field of academia. Secondly, neoliberal, the problem the countries have is not with neoliberalism, it's with technocracy, using data and numbers to crunch out and determine policies as compared to actual political considerations and things that impact people on the ground. In your world, when it's literally a panel of experts, here's what's going to happen. All of the austerity things that you talk about in OG is going to happen anyway, but it's going to be significantly worse because there are no outside actors that are able to temper the types of negotiations or deals we have coming. For example, when the 2008 crash happened, Greece was like on the verge of a failure, and the IMF did impose austerity. But the reason why Greece was able to make it out of that austerity was because there were other states like Italy, for instance, within the EU that had voting rights that were able to implement significant changes to the negotiations and were also able to advocate on Greece's part. Because my point is this, you are a member. In a world where it's an independent organization, you literally have no say to it. You have no control over the amount of funding that is going into these organizations as well. That's why it is significantly worse in the world of government. So let me move on to my arguments. Now, I want to first ask a very important question. What is the fiat of government in this debate? Government can fiat that these organizations will get funding. We're not going to contest that. What we want to contest is how much funding they are going to get specifically. Now, the first thing I'm going to answer here is, I think the amount of funding they're going to get is significantly reduced to the point that it's going to be harmful. I have 6 reasons for this. Firstly, there is a loss of control, which means nation states are not a part of the decision-making process. This is very bad because politically, to sell it to your people, you also need to be able to have sellable and buyable messages. If your message to the people is that we are giving money to this organization, God knows what they do with the money, we have no say into it, congratulations, you get slaughtered in the next election, right? Especially in a context where anti-globalization and anti-establishment politics is catching on very strongly. The fact that Trump narrowly lost the election shows that we're not out of the woods yet. Secondly, in terms of funding, many of these states are not altruistic in the way they fund. What does this mean? They only give funding to the Bretton Woods institutions like IMF and etc. because they know they can control the terms and conditions of this. This is to suggest the reason why the United States was willing to fund countries, especially in Southeast Asia, was because they were able to put in conditions that would put in favorable governments to the United States. This is ranging from Vietnam to Malaysia to Thailand. This is the reason why they fund us as well, because they want to expand influence too. The third is, I think this is a very unpredictable panel. We have never tested this in the status quo. We've never seen this before. And I think to not know what decisions this panel of experts is about to make means that countries cannot have a guarantee on their returns as well. Thus, they are likely to be quite cautious too. CG, hold on, I'll take you at 555. Third is like, you cannot have payback, like you cannot have profitability from giving money to these organizations because you cannot attach very specific loan conditions and very specific conditions that allow for countries to make returns in terms of their loans. That's why countries give out loans, because they are able to have influence within these regions, but also force other nations to be at their beck and call to begin with. My point is, there are 4 very good reasons why they're going to take away quite a substantial amount of funding, and Gov has to deal with this. Before I move on, CG, you have a question?
Did Donald Trump effectively get sanctioned for the fact that he never truly reduced funding to any sort of international financial institutions?
Yeah, Trump is Trump. I'm talking about the developed countries as a whole. This is their incentive structure. That's why they are going to do it. So let me talk about the harms of this. In a world where there is significantly reduced funding, I think this impacts the Bretton Woods institution, or not, sorry, like this organization quite significantly, in the sense that they have to make severe choices between which nations to prioritize. So this means racing to the bottom in terms of which nation is so poor that we have to give money to begin with. And I think the problem is when it comes with a significant amount of reduced funding, it means that many countries on a net are likely to be left out and have not many other alternatives to go to. And this is very important because the current context is many economies across the developed and the developing world have been wrecked as a byproduct of COVID, bar the fact that you are one of the lucky countries that didn't get impacted. What does this mean? There is a very happy actor that gives out money. It's called China. China is more than willing to expand in BRI and enter developing nations when this institution will not step in for them. There are a few reasons why this is harmful. I get that the UN is bad, but China is significantly worse because they are predatory in the way that they make types and they give out loans. For instance, look at Eritrea, the way the diamond industry has effectively been hijacked by Chinese companies just because of a couple of loans that they got from China as well. My point is this. They need money. They're going to go somewhere. Given you have a significantly reduced amount of funding in the world of government, they push developing countries to a far worse actor. That's China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder, we don't credit anything that comes after 7:15, but I mean, you know the drill. Okay, well, out of the way, I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. You're here.
Awesome. Okay. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Okay. I think today's debate, opening government would try to run a really clean case with a clear logical line that essentially breaks down several things. First, we'll tell you, and as my partner did, why the existing system don't work and have a history of failure, and the impact of that is detrimental to the future possible allocation of aid or development plans that these institutions might come up. To the point at which, if we prove that the current mechanisms simply don't work, then we go down to prove why why a GS, this new system of the plans of development or organization is needed. Then we'll go down to prove why these developed nations as actors will still have an incentive to give funds to these to this new organization, which is what OO accused us of not doing. So I will be doing that, and then eventually we'll tell you why the new system would be effective. So to reiterate what my partner has told you, we told you two things, two characterization why of the existing program simply doesn't work. First, we tell you that there's a history of failure, to the point at which the current system, such as World Bank, WTF, or IMF, functions on this idea of only pushing neoliberalized policies such as structural adjustment program. We see a long history of failures where a lot of third world countries essentially have been screwed up by exactly the program that are pushed out by this existing system. So what is the impact of this? The impact of this is not only just these countries experienced more instability, not enough development, and more economic crisis after the implementation of such development plans, we also see that there's a tainted image to the developing world. All obviously agree with our point when they tell us a history of US funding other countries for the sake of establishing puppet regime. Now, developing nations see it as an infringement on their sovereignty, and the weighing between the benefits they could potentially get simply does not go in line with what they will lose over their own national sovereignty. Therefore, the impact of this is that the current mechanism simply no longer works if developing nations are unlikely to accept your support, but rather go to a different actor with ulterior motive. And in this case, we actually then co-opt OO's point about how China will gain more power somehow in our world. We're telling them that in OO's world, in status quo, China is already gaining more power because, for example, places like Africa, where they have been screwed over by structural adjustment program, are more likely to go to an actor like China because they see China as somewhat more reliable than an organization like the WTO. Therefore, we tell you that this harm already is existing under status quo. So it's really not our own burden to bear. And then we tell you that under status quo, you see a lot of developing nations becoming directly antagonistic towards the current system, like the Doha round negotiation gridlock that my partner tells you. Therefore, we would argue that essentially we take away the effectiveness of the current mechanism. If the current mechanism simply is ineffective, therefore we demand a new mechanism to replace such a failure of system. Then why should developed nations want to help even though they have a history of bad behaviors and failures? Now we go into this incentive structure that OO accuses us of not having, for precisely 3 reasons. First is just this general idea of global responsibility of wanting to help out, because like a lot of things are interconnected because of globalization, such as, for example, global health that we're experiencing today. Secondly, the market that they want to tap into before with their neoliberal policy remain lucrative. For example, Africa is one of the most promising regions in the world. Many countries obviously still see these underdeveloped regions as holding massive economic potential. So they do have a pragmatic incentive behind wanting these places to develop and have the proper infrastructure and development plans. Thirdly, and potentially the most realist, because that's what flies in the debate round, is the most realistic pragmatic reasons as to why these countries want to help. Panel noticed that developed nations should want the plan of globalization and development to not reside in the hands of a single actors. What do we mean by this? We don't think it is in the best interest of Russia if US dominates World Bank policy and guide the path of globalized development for the third world. And we also don't think it is in US's best interest if China somehow succeeds with BRI, because third world countries don't want to go for the traditional old global organization like the World Bank because of the bad memories they have with them, right? So what we then mean in this case is because of the ineffectiveness of the current traditional organization, it is likely that one country like China or US or Russia will control the development plans and process of globalization. This is therefore bad for the other developed nations. This then creates the exact incentive OO is asking for. The incentives for the developed world as a whole to give money to a neutral organization and let a neutral body of experts to develop plans of development and give aid so that no one gets ahead with their own plan for the third world countries and no one gets to power project through aid and model of development. Notice that this is a realist pragmatic solution to what OO is proposing, which is what if third world countries go to some actors but not the others. The developed world as a whole should want to give money to this neutral organization precisely because of prevention of power projection. Before I go down to solvency, CO.
In your world, the US president is still going to call up at the GSF and say, we're not going to give you money unless you give money to our allies. What changes in your world? They still have the power of the purse to blackmail this organization.
To address your specific example, if US allies is in need of aid, we don't see it as a problem if US push to give them to aid. And in your world, this kind of balances out if China's like, hey, you also need to give money to like poorer countries that we have ties with. It's not essentially a bad thing. But going on to that, at best, your impact is non-unique because in both worlds, these countries have an impact on this organization. But at least in our world, we get the marginal benefit of third world countries likely to accepting aid from this newer organization because there isn't a tainted image that comes associated with such aid. This is where we go into our solvency, right? Why is GSF would be more effective now that we've proven the incentive structure of developed nations to give money? First, no tainted image and historical bad memories. Fine, if Backhalf wants to argue that developed nations will still have a hold over these institutions, we'll tell you that no tainted image is still a benefit because current system changes, the tainted image will still largely, like the distrust is hard to break and won't break away. This is why Africa is leaning towards China as opposed to the new policies that WTO is putting out. Secondly, panels of experts won't be neoliberal, precisely because the panel of experts would be diverse. The Washington Consensus is not the most popular ideal anymore. Understand that there have been many countless studies over how countries have suffered from neoliberal policies, and to the point at which we believe that there's a panel of experts from, for example, third world countries, we believe that like there will be more solvency on our side. Proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. And to close out the opening half, I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of UP. You're here.
Am I audible? Thank you. Yeah. I think the primary issue with the opening government's case is they don't necessarily explain to us a convincing incentive structure as to why countries are going to maintain the degree and the amount of aid, the scale of aid they're giving currently towards things like development aid, humanitarian aid, and etc. I hope it's not just me finding OG's logic extremely convoluted, but I'll try and take the best versions of their case and explain to you, even if there is an incentive to care about things like regional stability and like global stability and etc., why this oftentimes are not enough geopolitically incentivized and geopolitically charged reasons to get the degree of aid that we're seeing right now. For example, like the OECD giving like close to trillions of aid to countries like Syria and Afghanistan, which are incredibly politically popular spots. Fair enough, but do receive significantly more amounts of aid that allow these countries to restructure communities in post-conflict circumstances. I think given these circumstances already, I don't think opening government explains the scale of it. I want to talk about one broad argumentation which extends beyond the incentive structure that Naveen already gives you in his speech, which is six-pronged, with regards to why technocratic decision-making processes within the context of like international institutions such as these are extremely horrible and don't end up increasing net benefit for countries who need this aid. Before that, two quick responses to the bizarre things that I heard. Firstly, with regards to the incentive structure that comes out from the opening government. Opening government says that there's things like, for example, neutrality and like global stability that is good enough to give incentives for countries to give countries that they are developed, i.e. things like G20, to have enough incentives to give like trillions of dollars in aid. Like, I don't think there's a explanation with regards to why regional or global stability itself is good enough of a reason. I think oftentimes in order for states to justify trillions of amount of aid to specific politically popular regions, there has to be a justification that politicians oftentimes have to give to its own mandate and to its own electorate to justify what brings back towards the country and what are ways in which this charges back the nation. This is exactly why if you look at the OECD's top 5 countries which receive aid, it is not countries who need aid the most. Unfortunately, it is countries that are oftentimes politically popular spots that are oftentimes have geopolitical vested interests that the countries can gain from. This is why it's politically popular for nations to err on the side of giving money to these countries. This is why the scale of money is significantly far more, because they can justify this and can remain in power. They don't explain why these kinds of decisions are politically popular and will be sustainable within these countries. But the second thing that I wanted that we heard from the opening government that doesn't fit into my argumentation is the idea that how there needs to be an incentive for countries in the third world to like take aid because apparently there's a tainted image of the IMF. Like, I'm not going to contest that there is a tainted image of like Bretton Woods institutions, but like there has to be a weighing here with regards to whether or not the tainted image of these Bretton Woods institutions weighs more than the need of these countries to take aid. It's so bizarre for the opening government to suggest that these countries are going to reject aid because of the fact that it's tainted when they're literally struggling from things like post-conflict societies, countries breaking apart, extreme poverty, lack of infrastructure and telecommunication grids and power grids, and like bulk of things that the AIIB currently funnels money into in the Middle East and also like areas that are within Asia as well. For all these reasons, I think the opening government is already out of this debate. Argumentation with regards to the process that is likely going to happen within these technocratic decision-making processes and why you don't necessarily make the world better in terms of allowing like significantly good amounts of restructuring within third world countries. Firstly, I just want to explain that there's a lack of clarity in opening government with regards to what exact metrics that these technocrats are likely going to do. The extent they say is just that that the IMF is neoliberal and these are individuals that are independent and are likely going to have expert knowledge. Let me explain to you what are likely going to be the metrics that you're going to see within these technocratic institutions. The first thing is I think you're likely going to want to prioritize things like giving more quantity of loans to more countries to increase the amount of like quantitative aid that you give to help more countries on net. I think the reason for this is because you want to try and look like you are just as successful as the IMF. You can help more countries and get as much popularity, and to try and suggest that you're just as legitimate and far-reaching as the IMF and other Bretton Woods institutions have been, because that's the most like proximate thing that people oftentimes or countries are likely going to compare yourself to. But I think more importantly, they're likely going to prioritize things like short-term, less scale funding projects to justify that these projects have been successful, and to allow like those smaller projects cumulatively to justify that these specific the GSF is successful and has been able to give money and create successful projects. Oftentimes, note these projects are short-term, do not extend to things like longer-term projects, because they want to get this confidence from these developed nations within a short period of time. Fair enough, Gulf can fiat that you get funding from developed nations, but you cannot fiat the fact that you get the same scale of funding. So this this GSF must do things and must behave in a way that can ensure and increase the confidence of these developed nations. Why then do we think this is a horrible process, and why these metrics oftentimes means that it's patently horrifying for a bulk of developing countries. The first thing that I will say is I think a lot of developing countries right now currently struggle from infrastructural deficiencies that require huge amounts of injections to like literally like rebuild entire regions, rebuild like telecommunication grid networks, like power grid networks, which takes oftentimes decades or like at least a decade to build these kinds of vast, expansive network systems to build like to introduce like stable infrastructures in this region. For this reason, you cannot have things like, for example, in the short run, GSF giving like huge amounts of aid to specific countries that are politically popular, but rather are just going to give to the countries who need it the most, but smaller scale aid. I think this doesn't explain why these countries are going to be able to like get the specific type of aid that they need for long-term benefit. Why then do we think the comparative is better under our world? Because say what you want about China and like having geopolitical motivations with regards to giving money within Africa, they've done a fantastic job with regards to funneling huge amounts of money in specific countries to prop up massive infrastructure, fair enough to get leverage in terms of being able to like use these countries later on in a symbiotic trade relationship with them. But I think also similarly, this means that there's huge amounts of scale to at the very least allow these countries to have this infrastructure. Look at Nigeria and how an entire telecommunication grid was built by China specifically because there was symbiotic relationships, because it needed things like these countries to be there for the Belt Road Initiative. Before that, sure, I'll take one from closing.
Do economists typically have model forecasts that show whether or not they are making wise decisions with regards to funding and other policy decisions?
Bro, what? Yeah, okay, yes, they do. But I'm suggesting that there's a variety of like gray area in which you can opt for metrics. You're likely going to opt for these metrics. If you want to flip this logic, feel free to explain it in your speech. The POI is very, very weird. Lastly, I think it's also going to deprive funding from current development projects in areas that are currently, for example, politically popular. This looks like, for example, a large chunk of funding from the IMF and Bretton Woods institutions being moved away towards the WSF if OG wants this, and if this is their best case scenario. This literally means it's going to be a financial vacuum and power rifts in countries that the OECD and your large IMF are giving money to right now because they are politically popular. This looks like literally war-torn regions that, fair enough, are not the countries who perhaps need it the most in terms of like whether or not you're the poorest country, but still are countries that are struggling from things like, for example, dictatorships and like struggling to like build in post-conflict societies, i.e. countries like Syria and Afghanistan, which you will literally push them back into conflict because you don't allow them to have the same degree amount of aid, because these are politically popular countries, but not necessarily countries who need it the most. For the fact that they lose and don't manage to meet the metrics of these technocrats, you doom these countries from being able to get any sustainable ability to grow beyond their conflicts. For all these reasons, opening opposition takes this debate.
Thank you for that speech, and thank you to the opening half as a whole. I'd like to welcome the member of government to continue on with the CG case. You're here.
All right, can everyone hear me just fine? My internet's been a bit spotty today, so I would appreciate if you just flag it if you think I'm cutting off at one point, and I'll switch to my hotspot instead on my phone.
If you need this, we're going to turn off our cameras just to be on the safe side.
For now, I think it's fine because the internet seems pretty strong right now. So
Cool.
Yeah, POIs in the chat is fine, thanks. On Closing Government, we're uniquely going to bring to you an explanation of the harms of the current institutions, how they hold countries captive and block out systemically aid to countries that most need it because of political agendas of donors. OP just simply doesn't seem to get that these harms are worth getting rid of these institutions for, and they might be worth the possible harm of having less money overall. But I'm going to be showing you secondly as well why we do not get less money overall. First, on the harms of current institutions. First, I want to point out a totally overlooked part of this debate, and that is the fact that the GSF will create a fund that in which money is specifically earmarked to resolve global crises. This is a major problem of existing institutions in which donor money is often bilateral, right? It goes from one country to another. This creates a situation that incentivizes countries to only help specific nations resolve specific problems, but not resolve problems of a more global nature. This is really problematic because some of the biggest problems we're facing today are transnational and crossover boundaries. For instance, climate change, for instance, environmental pollution, the spread of viruses such as the pandemic, and for instance, transnational refugee crises. These call for a more concerted effort than the World Bank or Asian Infrastructure Bank is equipped to deal with right now. And that's why that is reason enough why an institution such as this is necessary. I'll also show you later on why it works, but I think that you need to bear this in mind when you acknowledge that the institutions that exist fail to solve some of the most pressing problems to date. This is particularly feasible and a reason why this institution is likely to succeed. And that is, developed countries will have an incentive to keep donating to the GSF or an incentive to even donate more, because the creation of this institution means that they can now solve problems that will affect them that otherwise could not be solved. They recognize it's in their interest to solve world problems such as transnational refugee crisis, which could destabilize their borders. For instance, rich countries in the Middle East right now donate to the GSF because they realize the money will get earmarked for solving their refugee crisis, or the US, who cares about climate change, for instance. This is in comparison to the World Bank and and other existing institutions, in which money that a small nation donates, even albeit a rich but small nation, for instance, Jordan or Egypt, for instance, does not necessarily go to resolving the problems that they want to resolve, because these institutions are held captive by the shareholders. So essentially the money gets determined, the use gets determined by the US, right? Which is something I think everyone has agreed on today. That's why we get more money from those institutions those countries that want to solve global crises but cannot in the status quo, to instead now donate to our GSF instead. That's how we actually get more money, because we earmark it to solve those global crises that countries want to resolve. But a second big problem with existing institutions is about how aid is simply not getting to where it's most needed. And I think OG severely under-mechanized this point, right? What we do with the GSF is we reduce the decision-making calculus from being one of what is the most politically advantageous for the donor countries to one that is most economically advantageous for the world, and one where the money goes to where it's most needed, right? We remove an important source of interference. Now, yes, we agree with OP, maybe the donors still have agendas and interests, but at least in our world, they cannot determine at the decision-making process where the aid goes. On the contrary, in institutions like the World Bank, decision-making is often done by a body that is appointed by the biggest shareholder or the biggest donor. In the case of the World Bank, it's the US. In the case of the IMF, it's China. And this is really problematic, and I'm going to impact this out, right? First, because it means that the decision makers who donate the most get to decide where the money goes based on their own geopolitical interests. So for instance, they avoid donating to Syria, an example O talked about, because of what they want to avoid getting tainted by the sectarian conflict there. Or they donate based on what is most advantageous for them to advance their position in other international bodies, for instance, the UN. For instance, when Algeria sat on the UN Security Council, they suddenly got an influx of money from the World Bank because the US wanted to buy them out so that they would vote the way they wanted on the Security Council. By no means is economic need being assessed here, rather political interest is being assessed here. And this means that some countries that are geopolitically insignificant get systemically locked out of ever receiving aid. They are the last pick in every existing international institutions. I'm talking about countries like Ethiopia, countries like Laos and Cambodia, countries that just simply get absolutely forgotten and ignored. And this is devastating because in this debate, they make up a large portion of people in the world, and those that face the most intense forms of suffering, because they're also often the ones that are most geopolitically have the least to offer, right? The poorest nations are the ones that geopolitically least relevant. I think this is reason enough to vote for this kind of a motion. And this is how you weigh it up, right? In OP's best case, maybe we get slightly less money, but the difference is this: we get slightly less money, but it is now going to countries that has never had it before, whereas in OP, they get lots of money, but it's only going to countries that have always had it. Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Israel, do these countries really need more foreign aid to build even more infrastructure that they do not need? I think that because our need is higher that we address, it's okay if we release less money, but I'm going to prove to you later on why we do not really receive slightly less money. The second thing I want to point out about problems with existing institutions is that the domestic interests of rich donors also determine how the money gets distributed in a way that's actually harmful to people who receive aid on side opposition. First, the kind of aid that is given out is calculated to maximize the benefit to the donor and not the recipient. That's why the World Bank gives a ton of grain as aid, because European countries want to sell off the excess exports. This is actually in the short term maybe a good thing for people who receive the aid, but it's a bad thing in the long term for those countries that are getting the grain, because it blocks out the ability of their local producers to compete on an agricultural way. And that is why aid that is tied to political agendas actually harms the people who receive it. Second, because the aid is inconsistent, right? It depends on election cycles. If the US suddenly has a domestic crisis, they withdraw all aid from the World Bank. And this is really bad for countries that depend on it, because now they've never developed those systems that they need to suddenly kick in a moment of emergency when the US withdraws all of the aid, and they're structurally disadvantaged because of their aid. This is why aid, even in OP's best world, is bad. Now I'll take a POI from opening.
Yeah, so you can't just say under your world you will have slightly less funding. Like, sure enough, you give money towards Ethiopia, but like that's significantly a lot lesser, and you'll get less ground that you cover. So please weigh that out.
So I don't think we'll actually get less funding. And it's because of this. It is so politically damaging for you to retreat from the international stage when you've already spent decades donating to the World Bank, etc. And it harms the global image of developed countries to suddenly withdraw from this power projection. Consider how Trump, who withdrew from the Human Rights Council, blah, 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 did everything that OP says that developed countries will do, got kicked out. And I think what part of that reason is because business interested voters recognized that Trump was hurting the US's image globally by suddenly withdrawing from these institutions. And I think therefore the most powerful donors, who actually are the ones who are most interested in maintaining that global image, because they're the ones interested in power projection, will not be willing to just withdraw the aid in a world in which the GSF arises and becomes the main body, right? Because it's so damaging for them. And also the money that they're donating might actually be a small amount to them. So it's not that politically costly for them to donate aid without strings attached, but it's super beneficial for countries where the currency is so much weaker and where a dollar goes so much further. And that's why this harm about the aid becoming lesser on side government actually is not a serious harm in this debate. The most important thing is that we get money where it's needed and we get money where it is wanted. We're so proud to propose this motion.
Thank you very much for that speech. And I'd like to welcome the member of UP to continue on with the CO case. Here.
Yeah, before I start, can you guys hear me because we had mic issues? Okay, I'm audible. Fine.
Yeah,
just give me a second to set up my timer. Oh, you also have your timer. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Before I get in my extensions, I want to talk about 2 observations that I've made about CG case. 1, they've made the claim that you have an incentive to donate more because you care about climate change and transnational migration and issues that affect you in their world. I would presume those issues still exist on either world. So presumably you'll still care about climate change and transnational migration, and therefore give it to the IMF or the World Bank or directly give aid to other countries. I don't think that there's more donation in their world. The second thing that they note is countries only give money because of their interests, and this locks lots of countries out. I just wanted to note that interests don't disappear in their world. Hamza very validly in his POI pointed out that in their world, what will happen is that countries will try to leverage the aid that they give to the GSF and still try to get it to their own allies. So it's incredibly unclear why the fucking Congo gets aid. But the last thing I want to note is if they literally interests disappear in their world, then there's no aid to be given to these countries, right? So interests are important when giving money away, especially taxpayer dollars. I'm going to talk about 3 things in extension. 1, I'm going to talk about the fact of competition, why that's necessary. 2, I'm going to talk about experts because nobody wants to. And 3, I'm going to talk about political complacency and why that's encouraged in their world. In terms of competition, I just want to point out one thing very clearly in terms of setting it up. In our world, it's not just bilateral aid or aid from the IMF or the World Bank, but there is regional cooperation as well. So for instance, if the World Bank doesn't give a fuck about you or the IMF doesn't care, there are still other organizations, say the AU, for instance, which oftentimes does give aid to countries like Ethiopia or the Congo, specifically because of the issues that they pointed out, right? Because if Ethiopia is politically, like, I don't know, the situation is bad, then there is the problem of transnational migration and so on and so forth. These countries do rely majorly on trade with each other. That's why they oftentimes do give aid to each other. So I think that also takes out a chunk of CG material. But there are 3 other alternative mechanisms within competition for why we get better aid. The first thing I want to note is just look at how the world operates right now. You can either go to US-backed or Western-backed institutions like the IMF or the World Bank, or you can go to Chinese-backed institutions like, I don't know, the Asian Development Bank or the AIIB. The reason why this is good for the world is because given that both countries or both institutions want to expand their sphere of influence, you can play them off against each other and ensure that you get a better deal. This is where we mechanize taking out structural adjustment programs of the worst kinds of policies, because developing countries now have much more agency in our world than they would in their world, specifically because they can make other actors compete against each other. The second thing I want to note is we also get better deals on our side of the house because there is an incentive for different organizations to use different experts to research the policies by other organizations. So yes, the World Bank might have structural adjustment programs, but the AIIB structures aid very differently. And I think that by virtue of having different organizations, we get much more research and much more literature, which enriches our ability to get better policies on our world. But thirdly, I want to flip this and suggest that point out, like, you know, the pot of funds decreases in their world. I would note that competition actually means that we have a greater pool of resources to give to these countries. Why? Because assuming that the US is an interest and wants more allies in the Middle East or Africa, and China wants the same thing for OBOR, I would note that this competition between these rivals means that they want to give more money to the World Bank or to the IMF or within aid to the bilateral aid. and this increases the pot of funds available to these countries. I would also note that this also means that if you want to expand your sphere of influence, you want to reach out to countries like the Congo, etc., because you want to ensure that this country doesn't fall into the hands of your enemy or your rival. So this proves three things. How do we weigh out? I think one, we are kind of resolving a contradiction or a logical inconsistency that happens in opening opposition, because opening opposition suggests that developing countries have lots of power when negotiating over aid because they become wealthy. That's why reform happens. But they also somehow suggest that developed countries have lots of power and they will only give aid because it's on their terms. This doesn't make sense. It can be either or. But what we suggest is developed countries still have their interests under our side of the house, but also developing countries also have agency. The second thing I want to note is this beats OG's analysis on neoliberalism, because we're able to tell you that neoliberal deals aren't the ones that are going to be accepted or given out. The last thing I want to tell you is this also takes out OG's claim about China and bad actors, because we have used or mechanized that claim to suggest that these actors are actually going to be competing against each other and give better deals. The second thing then in this extension, with regards to experts, I want to note three problems with this. One, experts oftentimes operate in their echo chambers. They are rich, they are educated, they are divorced from real world policies and real world issues. I would note that it is incredibly important for people other than experts, people who are political brokers, who have networks within developing countries, who can communicate with them, tell them and negotiate what the best kind of deal is, what they want in the deal, what they don't want in the deal, and then criticize what these experts bring out in their policies, right? This is how we get reform from neoliberal agendas. I think that's the first thing. The second thing to note is, given that we have lots of organizations operating in our world, we have regional representation. That is to say that if the AU is giving aid to African countries, then the vast majority of experts employed by the AU are fundamentally African or from those countries. This means that you have contextual things, therefore you address context much better in our world. Why don't you do that in their world? Because note, for you to be on this expert panel, you will need to have an education. The best institutes are unfortunately LSE, not UCLA. The second thing I want to note is with regards to experience and research, right? You need to have lots of finances and resources to publish millions or thousands of papers on the matter. And usually people from developing countries don't have that. We have much more regional representation on our side of the house, therefore better policy. The third thing I want to note is definitions of development fundamentally are altered in this world. What do I mean by this? Development is not only economic, guys, there is political development as well. Oftentimes economic experts cannot make these trade-offs, right? You might want to prefer, I don't know, income per capita considerations, but what if doing that means that you roll back democratization processes in lots of countries and remove political freedoms? I think that this is extremely important, because these are the kinds of people on our side of the house who at least have these considerations in mind when they're making this bet. I think the third thing over here is what they fundamentally also do is that they politicize expertise. Even if these experts aren't political, they are perceived to be political at the very least. So who are they giving aid to? They're not democratically elected. They're giving bad aid packages, whatever. That's the public perception of these experts once you're giving your taxpayer dollars to them. The problem with that then is, once you label experts as biased and political, you are likely to reject the research that they do. So any sort of progression in terms of aid goes down. The last thing then about complacency. I want you to note that this debate is not only about giving money to countries. Giving money doesn't affect shit. Implementation matters as well. But note, when Pakistan takes aid from the United States of America, given that it is a military ally or trade ally, and it's giving them aid, it is very difficult for the Pakistani government to say, oh, the reasons why we didn't get economic development is because the US gave us a shit aid package. They are your allies. You can't criticize them as much. But in their world, you are able to say these experts gave us a shit deal because there are no political costs to saying it. Why does this matter? Because you can get away with corruption. You can get away with misuse. So even if they give lots of money to Congo, I'm not sure why that does jack shit in this debate. For all those reasons, very proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. And now I'd like to welcome the GovWeb to close with the GovBench. Here.
All right. If people could put POIs in the chat, that would be great. Panel, the World Bank is a political organization. That means that it gives aid not where aid is, means in the status quo, it gives aid not where aid is needed and not where it's useful or wanted. The GSF isn't perfect, but it depoliticizes foreign aid and makes it so much better. One note on CO, and most of my clash is going to be interwoven. I think that CO makes this very strange assumption that the nations that are seeking out development aid, that are seeking out for foreign infrastructure are those that like are able to like sort of leverage between buyers, that they have like multiple people courting them and seeking them out. I think that this is very strange, right? Like I think that the idea that like a nation that is plagued by poverty, likely conflict, likely instability, corruption, other forms of like governmental distress is able to like leverage the World Bank and the AIIB off of each other because both of these nations just want to give away this money is probably very unlikely. All right. First, on the clash about the quantity of donation. Couple responses here. First, we say that it is unlikely that we reduce international commitments because yes, there are like isolationist right-wing politicians in power, but they tend not to follow through on their commitments to retrenchment, which I referenced in a POI. Why? 3 reasons. First, there's a massive harm to their image abroad when the US pulls out of places like Botswana, Namibia, etc. That fuels a lot of anti-US sentiment in these places. We say that that harm is compounded by the fact that no one developed country is the unequivocal global hegemon right now. And if you don't do something, your competitor will. So if the US pulls out, China is going to step in. If China pulls out, the US is going to step in. So they have an incentive to remain like globally involved. In contrast, there's a relatively small cost to not reducing international commitments in terms of domestic support. Voters are low information in foreign aid, and they don't actually end up penalizing leaders for not following through. That's why, like, even when Trump pulls out of the WHO, he doesn't pull out of the World Bank. He doesn't meaningfully reduce America's foreign aid commitments abroad. Talk is cheap. They don't typically end up following through on these commitments. Second, even if the US gives less money, we say that that money is going to be used more efficiently on our side of the house to the impact that it is net better because it serves the most needy and it's used for projects that don't destroy the domestic economy and instead inspire growth. Third, we say that now middle income and smaller wealthy countries give more aid and more by multilateral pooling because they feel the process of disbursement is fairer. So that means that we offset any sort of decrease that you're going to see from like the US, the UK, et cetera, from all these middle income and upper income nations that now see these development institutions as like a place where their money and their agency is also honored. First point of clash then, on better targeting. OG runs your standard neolibs bad argument, never actually warranting why neolibs are bad, but this argument is extremely under-nuanced, especially considering that the World Bank doesn't have the power to enforce structural adjustment like the IMF, which has the power to punish by stopping loan disbursements. I say that this is probably quite low salience if the World Bank wants nations to integrate to a market economy, because there's no enforcement mechanism with foreign aid, which is literally just like them giving you cash. It's not a loan that you have to repay back, right? Co-lend gives you a much more robust mechanism that's World Bank specific. What does she say? She says that the World Bank, because it is led by a US citizen appointed by the US because the US is the largest shareholder, and the AIIB is like largely accountable to its largest shareholders, which is China, it's headquartered in Beijing, means that there's a comparative politicization as to how aid is dispersed, i.e. which countries receive aid. 3 mechanisms she gives here. First, she says that developed countries try to buy off developing countries by offering aid to the countries with the biggest strategic advantage if they enter the sphere of influence. For example, is a well-documented phenomenon that the countries rotating onto the UN Security Council get double-digit point increases in the amount of aid they get per year because the US wants their vote on the Security Council. This runs counter to the idea of the most needy getting the aid. Closing op says in response, you're going to be able to play institutions off each other to leverage a better deal. But again, which countries are the ones getting those multiple offers? It's not the ones that are the most in need where the money should be going. It's probably the ones that offer some sort of strategic advantage. They're relatively privileged and they're going to be fine in like either world. The countries that we're concerned with are the ones that are not getting aid currently, and they're going to be able to get aid in the status quo, even if they don't have that strategic advantage because there's no longer a politicized benefit. Second, we say that the World Bank has the disincentive to take care of issues with like diffuse or far off harms because of a lesser short-term political benefit, especially when there's no earmarked global crisis fund, and these problems like climate change are usually cross-border. We uniquely fix for that. Third, we say that there are diverse experts that are probably more willing to give money to places of sectarian conflict where the World Bank doesn't give the money because it's seen as a political decision. Think of like South Sudan. US doesn't give a ton of development aid there because it's seen as pissing off like Sudan proper, which means that it's going to like have consequences with like oil disbursements, etc. Now the World Bank can do that if it decides that South Sudan is like where the money should be going, because it's not a political decision, it's purely an academic one. We say that this is the most important point in the round because foreign aid is meant to give a boost to the worst off, and we do that. In the status quo, this aid is used incredibly inefficiently and does very little to actually alleviate poverty. We say this is not about the size of the pot, it's about who gets a portion of the gains. Final point of collapse then is on how we get more efficient aid. This replies to all of OO's claims that economists are like neoliberal technocrats and make bad decisions, and also CEO's claim that economists are like likely to have gone to Harvard and Oxford and have biases. Sure, these biases are like comparatively smaller than the biases that you see in the world where like it's dominated by the World Bank and the AIIB. Why are these nations much worse actors than the GSF? First, as a direct response to CO, we say that experts might have like a Harvard or Oxford or LSE education, but Abhijit Banerjee isn't from the West, and it is a comparatively more open path to international experts who, yes, might have been educated at Western institutions, but don't necessarily have to come from Western contexts. Their best case on side opposition is that like Lesotho goes to the AU and is able to get money from African economists. It is unclear to me in what world the African Union is ever going to have as much money as like the global the GSF or like any sort of institution that is able to leverage at least some money from developed countries. That pot is just like you're just going to have a lot more money and a lot more expertise to take advantage of when you have these economists from like these Western institutions. I'm sorry, if they can prove to me that the African Union is now going to be able to take on and be like a comparable institution to the World Bank, I think that is a high bar for them to prove. Second, we say that experts are independent, which means that they're more likely to offer funding that does not have provisions or forms that benefit only the West, like giving grain aid and displacing local farmers by crashing the grain market. Third, we say that experts are less likely to invest in things like vanity projects, like they're more likely to build things like public toilets and not shiny bridges, or projects with politicized implications, like menstrual projects to schoolgirls, because again, they don't care about like whether or not it's a shining example for the US hegemony. It's instead an example as to like whether or not you're doing good in the world. We also say that they care more about long-term projects than projects with short-term payoffs. That takes out OO's point about time. Finally, we say the experts care a lot about being seen as experts after they're done at the World Bank, if only so that they have a job after after they're done at the GSF, if only so that they have a job after being done at the GSF. OO sees that there are objective metrics that economists can be evaluated on with respect to like whether or not they did their job well, so they have an incentive to be good at their job, versus America doesn't really care if like people in Kenya are like, bro, you fucked up. An economist wants to be seen as good at their job. They want to see as having performed well in accordance with the models and the metrics and the objective measures of progress. So yes, these economists might have a Western bias, but they are comparatively much more accountable than anything that like the US is going to do, anything that Beijing is going to do. We say that you get better forms of aid, more efficient aid, and we get better disbursement to the most needy actors. For all these reasons, proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech, and thanks to the entire government. And now to close the round, I'd like to welcome the OPWEP here.
Four claims we made in this round. One, it's a good thing that the Asian Investment Bank exists and the World Bank exists. You can play them off each other. Their response, these countries are war-torn, they'll be forgotten anyway. I want you to think about this claim for a second, because short of Syria, I can't think of a single country which applies in closing government's world. Every country has some benefit to offer: domestic labor markets, regional and strategic cooperation. Like there's so many reasons why, natural resources, like there's so many reasons why each individual country would be valuable. That's unclear to me why, short of like a war-torn country with no economic potential whatsoever, foreign actors won't care about tapping into their market. Hence, this means that our competition point still stands, because vulnerable countries, I know Pakistan is sort of okay, it's not a civil war, but 50% of people live below the poverty line. Those countries can still leverage the Asian Investment Bank and the World Bank against each other. Our second claim, this idea of regional cooperation. They said it's a high bar to prove that the AU will be as important as the World Bank. If only we had tried to prove that. What we were trying to say was that the AU works on regional development initiatives. It's a different category of cases than competing directly against the World Bank. In their world, the only way you can get aid to Malawi is vis-a-vis the GSF. In our world, at least, you are more likely to have political buy-in because Nigeria and Sudan care about Malawi in the first place. So regional development actors, which were completely missed by every other team in this round, create incentives for political buy-in and expanding the pot of money, also weighing against OO. The third claim that we had in this debate was about experts. And this was fucking fantastic, because she said, look, Abhijit Banerjee is not from America, right? So people like these exist. I know he's brown, but I promise he was born in the United States. Two, Abhijit Banerjee being brown or being Indian has nothing to do with how dislocated he is from elite epistemic communities and not being part of the fundamental Indian experience of rural poverty. And three, we gave you additional things about experts. The fact that they don't know what anything, they don't know about anything apart from what they're experts in. So for instance, Eva said this very interesting line. She said, we want to work on objective metrics. That's a very interesting word, isn't it? Like objective metrics, because we showed you that development is a social and political construct, right? right? Like per capita income improvement doesn't do much if you're also curtailing freedoms, or maybe it does, who knows? I don't know, because it depends on each country's intersubjective understanding of what development means. What they do is that they entrench specific experts' understanding of what development means. But crucially, remember panel, experts are horrible communicators, horrible political brokers, because remember, these people are good at researching in the MIT poverty lab. They might necessarily not be good at sitting down with Malawi's finance minister and saying, this is how you need to build the dam, this is how we're going to look after you. So what we showed you was that the political incentives are good and a burden that opening opposition shied away from. Political actors are great because political actors can work with local political actors from aid recipient countries and then show to them how to get things done because they have a knowledge of those political cleavages as opposed to being ignorant of them. The final claim that we made in this round was perhaps the most important, because every team in this round just assumes there's this strange like Western understanding of if you throw aid at a country, it's equal to change. There's this fucking transmission mechanism in the middle called the local government. No one talked about them. Taha uniquely showed to you that local governments are much less likely to be politically complacent in our world. Why is that? When US aid gives money to Pakistan, Pakistan can't say that US aid was the one which fucked up because US is our ally. For instance, when India gets aid, or Bangladesh, for instance, gets aid from China, they can't say, yeah, fuck China, because they're part of the One Belt and One Road program, right? So by virtue of the political incentives, again, there is no political complacency in our world. In their world, it's so easy to blame this like amorphous panel of experts which exist, which means that complacency is significantly worse on our world. So it doesn't just matter how much aid there is, we introduce a second dimension into the debate. It's about how that aid is utilized on the ground. Let's quickly talk about closing government. One, I just want to point out this idea that money is given during crises in the GSF. Most aid is given during crises. If anyone studied development, they'll know there's an entire theory called crisis development, that international actors only give money when an earthquake happens, when a flood happens, but not long term. So problem solution gap there. Two, political incentives to cooperate are completely symmetric. China and the US still care about climate change. China and the US still care about transnational refugees. The only thing that changes in their world is now you have to cooperate through a global organization and you can't have regional cooperation. What goes away? For instance, development money which goes through the Clean Water Treaty between India and Pakistan, the Central Asian Water Development Treaty. These are all development initiatives which are regionally controlled. In their world, all of this money has to go through a global pot, which means that actors are much less likely to have buy-in because experts decide as opposed to regional actors and regional experts deciding, which means it makes things significantly worse. The final claim that they had was this strange forgotten nations argument, that nations are forgotten. I actually can't think of a nation which is truly forgotten except for maybe Syria and Yemen. Like the vast majority of poor countries have something to offer for reasons I've given you. Number two, these forgotten nations, again, such as like Pakistan, India, etc., can play off aid organizations against each other. But the third claim that I want to identify is really important. If they're arguing that political incentives are intrinsically linked to economic aid disbursements, how does that change in your world? Like if the entire global Western order is based on giving aid out to countries, what happens tomorrow when the GSF exists? Do these structures just disappear of political lobbying, backroom deals, etc., etc.? This means that there's very little change in their world because the political incentives that they said are so entrenched will still be entrenched. So it's extremely unclear to me how the circularity of that logic works. Finally, I'm going to talk about opening government. Before that, I'll give them an opportunity to engage. OG, go ahead. OG? CG, go ahead. CG, quickly, please.
Thanks. Sorry. Some countries are always going to be the last pick in your institutions. Yes, maybe Trinidad has labor to offer, but unfortunately they don't have oil or power production possibilities, so they don't get any money from the US-run World Bank. So how do you deal with the fact that the most needy countries are shut out?
Trinidad gets aid from regional actors. We've already talked about this. B, Trinidad might not have a competitive labor pool, so other actors might be interested. It might not be the World Bank, it might be the AIB. If it's not the AIB, it might be the Latin American Development Bank. So there's always competition. I mean, I've given structural reasons here. You just repeated the same point. Let's talk about opening opposition and why we win against them. 3 reasons why we win against them. Firstly, opening opposition's claim is that experts are bad, but they never do the flip, which is the harder burden. Why is politicization good? We give you several reasons why political actors are crucial in terms of eliminating complacency, in terms of improving regional cooperation, in terms of competition. This is really important to understand. Number 2, I feel like they have a slightly strange straw man of opening government's case where they say, like, you know, what happens here is that, like, if all this money goes towards the GSF suddenly, then the money will dry up. I just think that's a disingenuous argument because it's likely going to be a gradual change. We take government at their best. But finally, they say that developing countries have criticized the IMF to reform them, but hegemonic actors control the IMF. Only one of those things can be true. We said realistically, the thing that's true is that the IMF is not going to be reformed. It's still significantly better for the 4 reasons we've given you. Panel, development aid is fundamentally political. We instrumentalize that on our world. We're very, very proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech, and thank you for this fairly high quality debate. We'd be happy to judge that. You know the drill, shake hands, make friends, and then we'll talk to you after the next semi is announced.
Thank you.
Thanks.
For the round.
Fun round, everyone.
Cool. I have my call personally, but I assume it'd be good to just give it some time. Has the stream been stopped, Julia? Okay, I hope.
Yes, please stop it.
I mean,
Nice.
we can go rogue, you know, and just be fully on public naked, but